Béla Bartók was one of the seminal composers of the 20th century. He was a Hungarian gentleman, a magnificent pianist. He trained as a pianist and a composer. And early on in his life, he became fascinated by the folk music, first of his own country, of Hungary, and then in general, folk music in the world. He had listened to Brahms' Hungarian dances, as they were called, and Liszt Hungarian rhapsodies, but all of that music, and generally before Bartók, many composers sourced so-called folk music, but it wasn't real folk music. It was a kind of adaptation of the sound of or the feeling of folk music. You can think all the way back to Mozart, who in one of his violin concertos wrote this famous Turkish march, which has about as much to do with the country Turkey as our Thanksgiving does. So Bartók had listened to these kind of superficial adaptations of a sense of Hungarian folk music, but he became fascinated with an exploration of what true folk music was from his country. And he became great friends with another Hungarian composer, Zoltán Kodály, and the two of them would travel around the countryside, actually in a horse-drawn carriage with very primitive recording equipment, and they would find the real folk of folk music and record songs and dances on wax discs, which they would then transcribe into musical notation. And in essence, Bartók was really one of the very first ethnomusicologists. And this study was really extensive and systematic and very deep. The result of it, in addition to forming a real encyclopedia, ethnomusicological encyclopedia, is that it truly influenced both of these composers, both Kodály and Bartók, but particularly Bartók. And the influence came in different aspects of music. Very specifically, first of all, was melody. The folk music of this area had scales which were completely different from the major minor scales that classical music was using up to that point. And this changed Bartók's sense of melody intensely. The second aspect, which was very powerful, was rhythm. There were folk songs that were danced to, which had very distinct rhythmic aspects, which were very different from Western classical music of that time. So with these influences, Bartók really became a composer that had a very distinct and very non-conforming voice in relationship to what other composers were writing at that time. But at the same time, he was a true traditionalist in terms of form and structure and how he used instruments. And being a great pianist, he was very knowledgeable in the entire history of classical music before him, particularly indebted to Beethoven, which is interesting in the context of string quartets. Beethoven really changed the idea of a string quartet. Coming after Haydn and Mozart, who had written many of them, Beethoven, as he did with many forms, was such a revolutionary that he expanded the possibilities of structure, the possibilities of length, the possibilities of how one wrote movements, the order of movements, and how he really revolted against all of the known forms as he got later in his life and created the possibility of infinite expansion and infinite imagination. The late quartets of Beethoven remain as some of the most imaginative formations of any music ever written. What's also very interesting about the Beethoven quartets is that they span his lifetime, so that you can truly understand the evolution of this great composer over his lifetime simply by listening to string quartets. The next great set of string quartets, the next most important set of string quartets, are those of Bartók, which likewise spanned his lifetime. The first quartet was written when he was in his 20s, and the last one a couple of years before he died. So again, you have this complete cycle of a composer's development. It's not random that this happens with a string quartet. String quartets are really the distillation of everything we have in music, because it's the absolute minimum of performers, the true essence of the music itself, without using all kinds of instrumental combinations to create different sounds, which can distract from the core of what the actual piece is. So it's almost like sketching the essence of what you write. It's like a great artist's drawings, charcoal drawings, pencil drawings, as opposed to a large canvas with paint, where the colors and the scope and the extra added dimensions they are misleading, but they're enhancing to what the core is, but the string quartet is the core. So in Bartók, with these 6 quartets, you really have the essence of the composer's evolution over a lifetime. What's particularly distinctive about the writing for these quartets is, first of all, that they are fiendishly difficult. They incorporate a language which was quite new to anyone playing them because of the inclusion of these folk elements, which aren't the Hungarian dance of a Brahms folk element, but the melodic strangeness of these different scales, the rhythmic strangeness for us of these dance forms. And Bartók used all of those, which is new for a quartet immersed in everything that's been up until then. So the challenge is, first of all, musically, understanding the sense of these melodic and rhythmic elements, understanding the shapes and the forms, which are sometimes quite unique. And then Bartók created and actually invented some very idiomatic ways of playing the string instruments. In particular, he incorporated a lot more pizzicato, which is when you pluck the string. But he also invented his own way of doing this, where instead of plucking the string sideways, you actually pluck it straight up, which results in it hitting the fingerboard and making a percussive sound. And this particular sound is actually known today as a Bartók pizzicato. When I write something and I want the Bartók pizzicato, there's a notation, which is a little circle and a line through it, not through it, but to the top, over the note, and that's called a Bartók Pitz. And the result is something like a very loud pizzicato sound along with a little drum, because hitting the fingerboard with a string that's been pulled like a rubber band creates that sound. In the fourth quartet, there is one entire movement which all is done pizzicato by all four players. They actually put their bows down on the stand and play the whole movement, different kinds of pits. The normal pizzes, the plucking, whacking pits, and also even like a guitar, strumming back and forth. All of this had never been done before. So there's an element of that. The other thing is the virtuosity of each instrument playing on its own, but then the combination of four of them playing with that virtuosity in very complex interactions. Some of the forms are also very interesting. The fourth quartet, for instance, has 5 movements. The first and the fifth are related. The second and the fourth are related. And the third becomes a kind of anchor for the rotation of these other movements and is the heart of the piece. One senses this. When you're listening to the piece, you hear the first movement, fine. You hear the second, then the third becomes very profound and powerful. And then with the fourth movement, you understand this has something to do with the movement I already heard, the second one. And the fifth one becomes a bookend and completes this harmonic structure of the whole piece. When these were first performed, they presented immense difficulties and challenges for string quartets. One of the first quartets to perform them was naturally a quartet from Hungary with a very famous Hungarian first violinist whose name was Sándor Vég, V-E-G-H, and it was called the Vég Quartet. And they recorded all 6 of these quartets one by one and were kind of the first exposure, wide exposure that everyone had to these. So 100 years later, what we have now is every string quartet in the world is really required to play these pieces. If you don't play these pieces, you're not quite legitimate. But still, they remained incredibly challenging and are normally played either one in the middle of a program someplace, a nice Mozart quartet, and perhaps a Bartók quartet followed by a Beethoven quartet or a Brahms quartet. Once in a while, they will be performed now as a cycle, but normally that would be done either matched with other pieces on a program. So for instance, a Haydn quartet and 2 Bartóks, and then a second program with a Haydn quartet and 2 Bartóks, and completing the cycle in 3 concerts. It is rather unfathomable for any quartet to be able to actually play all of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in a row. That's a marathon. That's a feat. That's a physical and more so a mental feat to be able to work out, rehearse, perform, and then do all of them one after another within 24 hours. Obviously, none of this would be possible without having played each one of them many times before. When I first engaged the Escher Quartet, which is many years ago, more than I can actually remember, it might be 10, it might be 15, something like that. On their first trip here, they played the 5th Bartók Quartet. And the audience was blown away. I was blown away. It was so commanding and so powerful and so full of energy and so impactful that everyone erupted at the end. And I've remembered that over the years. And at some point, about a year or 2 ago, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, I asked them if they would consider doing the cycle. And at that time, I actually had been thinking along the lines of what normally is done. They would do 2 concerts, 3 concerts, and incorporate all of them so that we got the cycle. But then, as sometimes happened, I had an idea. And I thought, there's no harm in asking. So I asked them, do you suppose you could play all of them in one shot? And they told me that actually they had been thinking about that and planning it to be done in New York in the season prior to this summer. And so we had a discussion about how we would do that, what was the most practical, and again, what was the order? Because obviously you could do them in any order. You could do 1, 4, 2, 3, 6. But I really was keen on the idea that an audience could go to this evening, and I'm not calling it a concert because it's kind of a bloated, memorable, it's a big fat concert. But that one could sit there and actually not only hear this incredible set of pieces, which in and of itself is a magnificent thing, but understand that while you're listening to this, you're actually getting a total description and immersion into this seminal composer's life. I mean, from being young and writing this quartet to being almost dead and writing the last one. And that's his life. And this set of pieces is something for a composer that always remains its own thing. If you write a string quartet and then you go on to other things, you write a piano sonata, you write a piece for whatever, a symphony, anything else, When you come back to the next string quartet, all of that doesn't matter. What matters is the first quartet and now the second quartet. And this remains its own isolated output. I can't tell you why, but that's how one senses it. And so in this evening, we have the incredible sovereign Escher Quartet playing the entire set of Bartók quartets, which they have done individually to the extent that they really can nail them and explode them into the audience. And the way we're going to do it is 2 by 2, so that you have number 1 and 2, an intermission for them as needed as for us, then 3, 4, another intermission, and then 5, 6. I believe my latest information is that given that we start at 6 and that this will end at 9, I believe we are going to be offering free snacks in the intermissions, which is a great idea. Don't bring them into the hall. Don't chew in the concert. But it's a magnificent evening. It's an incredible opportunity to have this experience, and it will be memorable. It will be something that whoever is there will always remember for the impact of these pieces, this quartet, and how they're able to play them. And altogether, the evolution of a seminal composer over his lifetime in this one form. And I would add, every living composer and every not living composer since Bartók is influenced as much by this set of quartets as they are by Beethoven. This is what we start with. We start with looking at these Bartók quartets, and everything that came after or will come after somehow has been enabled by the incredible imagination, the incredible incorporation of elements into our Western music, which were not there, but now are there. And a way of looking at, studying, and coming to terms with ethnic music, folk music. Bartók actually eventually went to North Africa and did the same thing with that. And since then, we have many composers that have been influenced by disparate cultures. A lot of Indonesian gamelan music has seeped into many composers. Obviously, the Asian composers incorporate Asian folk music, instruments, Japanese, shakuhachi, different things like that. And Bartók really was the beginning of all of that. So I hope you will be encouraged to come experience this, and I guarantee you will not forget it.